Hi, welcome everybody who's joining us now. We'll get started in about just a minute. Welcome to everyone who's joining the All Hazards Consortium virtual discussion series. We'll get started in just about a minute.
The only sunshine in Maryland today is on my background.
No, it's sunny by me, Tom.
Oh, it is?
Yes, by me too.
The sun just broke through today. I feel like a mushroom.
Yeah. All right, I still see some participants are joining us. Welcome.
Hi,
Still
everybody.
waiting for a few more.
Good afternoon, everybody.
Yeah, and if you have a second, go ahead and chat us hello in the chat room. Let us know where you're from. If you're in the power industry or if you're just listening to learn. And we'll get started in just a few seconds. All right, I see some chats coming through. Welcome to Mark Scott from DCH SEMA. Gary with Tampa Bay UASI. Oklahoma City's in the house. He works with electric utility. We have a retired utility executive, Anthony. Hello. Dominion Energy is here. Alan Bradshaw, welcome. Hi, Dave. All right. And it's sunny in Clarksburg, Maryland, also in Montgomery County. That's where I am.
Well, the sun just broke through.
It's because we started our webinar, Tom.
All right. Is that what it is, right?
That's
Yeah.
right.
Keep chatting us hello. Let's go ahead and get started because I do have it's about 2 minutes after 4. My name is Laura Johnson. I'd like to welcome you to All Hazards Consortium's Business Resiliency Virtual Discussion Series. Today we're going to talk about powering through building critical infrastructure resilience. And that is not a title that I made up. It's actually a book that we're going to learn about today in the webinar. I just want to have a few administrative comments before we get started in meeting our panelists. Everyone's on mute today, but feel free to use the chat room or the Q&A section to send us a message or type in a question. We will be recording today's discussion and we will send it to you after the webinar so you can share it with friends or listen to it again. I'd like to welcome all of you for coming. There will be a chance to ask plenty of questions at the end. Today's webinar should last about 60 minutes. So on our panel today, we have Mary Lasky, who's the chair of the InfraGard National Disaster Resilience Council, and she also works with Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory. We have Bill Harris, who's the Vice Chair of InfraGard National Disaster Resilience Council and Director Emeritus Foundation for Resilient Societies. And hopefully joining us shortly should be retired Captain Bruce Churchill from Pacific Regional Representative and National Transportation Sector Chief of the InfraGard National Members Alliance. So we'd like to share with you a new book that the InfraGard Council is working on called Powering Through Building Critical Infrastructure Resilience. And I'd like to address our first question to Mary. Mary, how did this book come about and who was involved in putting it together?
So thank you, Laura. I first want to say thank you to Tom Moran for endorsing the book and for making today's webinar possible. So thank you so much, Tom. It's just wonderful. Before I go into what were the drivers that really made this happen, I would like to just give everybody a little bit about what is InfraGard and what is the National Disaster Resilience Council. InfraGard is a nonprofit organization that is about 25 years old and has about 73,000 members from across the United States and has 77 local chapters throughout the country. The National Disaster Resilience Council has been meeting since 2011 and has been holding seminars every year And in 2015, decided to write a book about doing exercises. We held an exercise and we did the Triple Threat exercise book. And then we wrote Powering Through from Fragile Infrastructures to Community Resilience. And that book is still very valid today. It's out on Amazon. It's very good. But from that book, we decided that we were very interested in what was happening with dependencies. We learned from that book about how important it was that water was just so vital. And so that drove us to wanting to do a new book. And that's the beginning of Powering Through Building Critical Infrastructure Resilience. So what motivated us? The thing that really motivated us was a desire to make a difference, to really do something to help the country. So there were 22 authors, and they come from across the country in various disciplines. And we came together. And one of the things that happened in doing that was that we had everybody who wrote a chapter was on the weekly phone call and sent out their chapter to all of the people, the other authors, and to the to people who had agreed to help us with it. And so everybody knew that one time they were going to be in the hot seat. And so we had constructive comments. Things got better and better. There were times when we would say, this chapter does not make it. You've got to redo it. So we'd redo something. And so the people that are on the panel today, all Bill Harris and Bruce Churchill and I were all authors, and Bill and I were editors for the book. And we've had 7 other authors who were took part in appendices. So that's how it came about, but really from the motivation of seeing what else was happening in the country with such things as the National Space Weather Strategy and Action Plan and the the Space Weather Operations Research and Mitigation activities and an executive order. There were things all along the way that helped us keep motivated and keep on keeping on.
Thanks, Mary. I can barely get 3 people on a 1-hour webinar discussion. How did you recruit 22 people? How did you find these experts?
Well, we asked them, and they seemed to be all motivated, and it was a wonderful group of people. And so that's how it happened.
Yeah, great. Well, why don't we, Mary, if you wouldn't mind tell us a little bit more about the focus of the book.
Oh, I'd be happy to. Well, first of all, we looked at what were kind of things that were disasters that might happen, so that especially that would cause the electric power to go off. So we looked at such things as what happens with a pandemic, what happens, and COVID-19 was just happening as we were really getting, so that part is in an appendix, but is something that maybe would be a great thing for another edition or some help to the book. But we covered pandemic, we covered earthquakes, and we covered cyber, physical attacks, what we call the space weather, and then we also covered the electromagnetic security. And that was done in 2 ways, both nuclear and a nuclear attack, and also what are called radio frequency weapons or intentional electromagnetic interference. So we looked at the disasters, and then for critical infrastructures, we looked at the energy, communication, water and wastewater, food and agriculture, transportation, healthcare and public health, emergency management, chemical, information technology, and operations technology. And then we also added a chapter on the National Guard because we thought that that was so important, especially tied to emergency management. So for each of the critical infrastructures, which became a chapter, we asked 3 basic questions. What happens to that critical infrastructure if the electric grid is down for 30 days or more? And then how could that infrastructure really help the grid get back up? So such things as the grid, the people working to restore the grid would definitely need water and wastewater, for instance. And the grid can't get back up unless there's communication. So that's how that would happen. And then the third question asked for all of these was the question of, what can you do to be more resilient? How could you mitigate this? And so that your particular critical infrastructure would be better and more resilient. One of the things that we created in doing this, which we were excited about, to have at the end of each chapter, something that we called notional charts. And that notional chart starts out in red and says, how do you move from being not resilient to being resilient? And how can you do that? And so they were markers of various kinds of things that stepped us through being red to yellow to green. And so those are the kind of things that the book is focused on.
Thank you, Mary. So Bill, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about this chart. A little hard to read on the screen, but we're going to send a copy to all of our listeners through the chat room. Tom, if you can help me out with that, that'd be great.
Okay, so thank you. We call this the stoplight chart, and so the colors represent a degree of loss of operability or perhaps total loss of some critical aspect of the infrastructures. So we array across the top the type of hazards that Mary has already identified. This starts the first, after listing the type of equipment or function on the left-hand side, we try to show what level of hazard or harm there might be. If you're in red, that means more than 50% of that asset may be inoperable or permanently lost. If you're in yellow, it means somewhere between 20 to 50% of that asset could be lost. If you are, every now and then we have a pink, which is kind of a combination of the red and the yellow, and if you're in green, generally it doesn't mean there's no damage, but not a significant level of damage. But one advantage of this stoplight chart is that you can begin to see, not just for a specific function, such as do you have emergency radio communications, or what happens if you lose water? But you can see these simple relationships, but you can then begin to look, what happens if I have a multi-hazard event, such as a solar storm that's used as cover for a cyber attack, or a non-nuclear EMP. It turns out if you hit some control systems with a pretty light level of radiation, we found through testing, many of them reset to the original password. So you can hit it with the radiation, take over the system, take control of it, and possibly pivot to attack another sector. So this is just an overview, and we'll provide it to anyone who wants. Tom will do that through the chat. But we learned, just briefly, we had a simpler stoplight chart in the 2016 Powering Through book, but we learned, for example, a transformer that's not under load is unlikely to be permanently lost. It might need some repair or maintenance. So we had overstated the hazards. And some in the electric utility industry think we are still overstating the hazards of transformers. but in fact, we track that we lose some of them during just moderate solar storms. And we know that the man-made electromagnetic pulse will have even more energy going through it. And so we have moderated and reduced hazards wherever we can, but we still see the potential for outages, some nationwide, a multi-weapon EMP or a really large solar storm covers coast to coast. A cyber attack might or might not. And earthquakes more likely to get a region. The pandemics, as we found with COVID-19, really have not only national but global impact. And so that affects who will be available. Will you have the mutual assistance that we get during a hurricane? We have electric crews from all over the country that pre-position and help restore. But some of these hazards are likely to occur in a way that the cavalry's not coming. So one of our main interests is consequence management. Not only that you have to prepare in advance and plan to recover, but to identify, since I don't have the resources in my company or in my state or in my region, what are the critical assets that need to be prepared now? What are the critical training and restoration plans that we need now? So that not to recover everything early, but to get the basic essentials functioning so the different critical infrastructures can work together. So I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Bill, thank you very much. Good afternoon, Bruce. I had heard Mary say earlier that power outages impact many different critical infrastructures. Transportation is one of them. Can you tell me a little bit more about that particular chapter of the book?
Sure, Laura, and thanks for having us on this afternoon. And Mary talked about the three chapters that, or the three questions that we posed to the authors, and quite frankly, that's how I got through writer's block, trying to sit there and figure out how am I going to describe this multi-headed hydra called transportation that has 7 subsectors, and the questions really helped. And so in looking at the impact, which is the first question, the first thing I discovered was that, and having experienced this in my own life as both a pilot and a ship driver, we rely totally on control systems. And if you have an EMP attack, for example, the highways are going to be undamaged, unlike an earthquake. The rail lines will be undamaged. The piers will be undamaged. Airport runways will be undamaged. But it's the control systems that operate the networks. And all you have to do, I'll give you an example of what happened in a wildfire in San Diego. It jumped 14 lanes of freeway, crossed over to Miramar at the time, Marine Corps Air Station, where there was a TRACON, air traffic control center that controls all Southern California airports. Well, because the wildfire caused an evacuation of the TRACON, we lost the ability to safely control air traffic in and out of airports all the way from LAX down to San Diego, Orange County, Ontario, and so forth, which then obviously crippled the rest of the nation's air network because of the number of flights that go in and out of Southern California. And that was just a wildfire evacuation. Imagine if that same TRACON lost power for an extended period of time. What impact would that have on the nation's air traffic control? Same thing with ships and with highways. Pipelines have control systems. So that was the first thing I discovered. The second thing was the number of vehicles involved in transportation. So what vehicles would survive and which ones would not? We don't know as much about vehicles as we do about the electric infrastructure itself in terms of their vulnerability. Certainly some vehicles, we don't know, for example, will diesel locomotives survive? Will trucks survive? 73% of our transportation is carried on the nation's highways via a commercial vehicle. So the survivability of trucks is obviously key to the impact. And then the last thing was people. Of course, the last thing we always think of is people. but think about all the folks that's necessary to run any of our transportation networks. It could be tugboat operators, it could be harbor pilots, it could be aircraft pilots, it could be the air traffic controllers, it could be the state DOT folks who manage the freeways, traffic system operators in cities. And having been in a major power outage in Southern California back in 2011, I can tell you that cities will come to a standstill when none of the traffic lights will work. So looking at the second question, then we looked at, okay, what does the transportation network do to support the energy sector? And you guys at All Hazards Consortium and Tom and Laura, you see that every day. You just saw it, you know, in the hurricanes, the various hurricane activations that we've had. Moving the electric utility vehicles from point A to point B obviously requires a functioning and operable and a safe communication or a transportation network. So that was a fairly obvious question to answer as part of the write-up. Then I looked at the last one, what can we do to make ourselves more resilient? And there were two things I looked at. One was logistics management. Bill was pretty familiar with a concept called blockchain, which I had never heard of before. And I'm now I think I can spell it now, but I do recognize that it is a critical component of managing the private sector transportation network. But what happens if blockchain all of a sudden collapses on us after, you know, after a major event like an EMP attack? And looking at FEMA, of course, has a logistics management system. The problem is that the FEMA system has no visibility into the private sector. And most of the shipments, about 75% of all disaster shipments, are actually provided by the private sector. So there's obviously things that we need to do to reconstitute our logistics management system so that we can keep the essential commodities and goods flowing where they need to be. And by the way, many of that stuff will probably come from offshore. As Bill pointed out, the cavalry is not coming. So we have an issue, I think, with providing resources from within our own country. So we're going to have to take a hard look on how we set up air bridges and sea bridges, which FEMA did an excellent job in supporting the shipment of personal protective equipment, PPE, during COVID-19. And we've heard about that on prior webinars. And then lastly was planning. Planning has to be done at a regional level, I think, to make us resilient. And I believe that if I look, for example, at COVID, in the early weeks of COVID, it's like transportation was not even on the radar. Truck stops were closed, rest stops were closed, and nobody ever thought about, hey, how do these truck drivers get across country without food and without a place to sleep and a place to fix their trucks? So typically we get, we're the last ones at the show to get considered. So I think regional planning, and I only, in looking around, I knew that the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area, way back in, I think, the early 90s or mid 90s, put out an excellent transportation, what I would call an emergency transportation plan. And I haven't seen a lot of those. I've seen a lot of emergency management plans that have transportation annexes, but I don't think enough thought goes into the complexity of what makes up our transportation network. And then just probably two other examples that I think do have the scope that we need, the kind of scope that we need. One is the catastrophic earthquake plan for Northern California, and the other one is the catastrophic earthquake plan for Southern California. But as Bill pointed out, I think they cover all kinds of great planning scenarios and planning responses, but they don't allow for the extended outage of power and the lack of national resources coming to your aid. So I think probably the first thing we need to do is to develop regional plans that are somewhat standardized so that they're interoperable, and that we can actually, if we plan a certain way in Southern California, that same thinking applies to the southeastern United States, to the Midwest, or to the northeast. And so that's kind of how I addressed, what our resilience posture should be.
Hey, Bruce, thank you so much. I'm going to actually pull in Tom Moran, who is the Executive Director of the All Hazards Consortium, with our next question. Tom, you have many years in working with the Fleet Management Group, and our first question addresses how can infrastructure owners and operators respond and recover faster from this type of electric power loss? Can you share with us what you've learned in your work with the Fleet Management Working Group? Tom?
You're on mute.
Okay, any questions? Sorry about that. Great question. One of the things that we've learned here is that the first step is really awareness, right? How does this affect me? And there's not a lot of forums outside of the cylinders of excellence, they used to call them, right? So electric does electric and water does water, and you've got these infrastructures of people that are set up for good reason, right? And these are the kind of thing we've learned is, it's going across those sectors that build the awareness that cause the planning to be more resilient. If there's no planning on something, resilience is a crapshoot. I think anyone's been around for a while to watch. We were just talking today with folks in the private sector. It's very hard to stay consistent on something if there's not planning, and sustaining planning is hard to do. Infraguard's a great model for that, right? They can survive turnover in a lot of things and stay focused on the issues that matter. So from our perspective, resilience is getting, for example, with electric, it's getting electric and the sectors that electric depends on working together on problems year round. So that's, in this case, would be comms and fuel and transportation. Then you go to the next tier. Well, what does comms need? Comms need fuel and access. And so it just kind of builds out. And the idea is if you can build planning groups by pulling in partners that are already doing that, and you have a collective effort, that's the way that you're going to improve resilience. Reading reports is great. Attending sessions and getting trained is great. But when it comes to a pinch, if I don't know Bruce, and Bruce has the information I need, we're both out of luck. So it's making these connections in the blue sky days where you can have planning, even monthly, you can have planning and start working the issues to improve resilience. And that's why I think this book became so important, because it's the first book I've seen, not the first, but probably the most comprehensive, that cuts across a threat, power loss, but it actually talked about the impacts and what you can do in each of these critical sectors. I haven't seen that before. So when I saw this, it was a great effort to put a stake in the ground to begin planning.
All right, Tom, thank you so much. Bill, I'm going to ask you same question, and also if you can talk to the concepts and technologies that are now available or will soon be available that provide for greater cross-hazard resilience.
Well, yes, thank you. So what we found is that if you try to do all hazards preparedness at the same time, you often become paralyzed because there's too much to do and too little money and too many constituencies with barriers. But we have had some quite adaptive enterprises that have done high hazard or major hazard resilience across multiple sectors. An example in Houston, Texas is CenterPoint Energy. They knew they wanted to do electromagnetic protection of control stations, of the substations after Hurricane Harvey, but they'd also had major flooding. So what they ended up doing is take a multi-hazard architecture and concept, and they designed components within the substations that would be electromagnetic pulse protected, the control systems, the operating systems, that would also work to protect against solar storms. But because these were lightweight, if they wanted to put the substation up on stilts to protect against flooding, they could easily design that into it. So what they ended up with is substations that cost 40% or less of the traditional cost for a new substation. And they had EMP protection, solar storm protection, ballistics protection, and then they also had fire protection and flooding protection. So when they went before the Public Utility Commission of Texas, no one's against them. They get cost recovery. If you ask somebody, why should I pay to get my substation higher off the ground? Well, if you lost power during the flooding, you know. So that's a concept that worked for them. And we've had examples in Puerto Rico where we just couldn't get enough generators. We had 1% of the population in Hurricane Maria, but we had almost 10% of the backup emergency generators, and we didn't have enough people trained. So they've begun to look at which of the three, there were 3 solar systems, and 2 of them were taken out, but one happened to be designed so the winds went through it and it survived. So you begin to design a new system that provides multiple benefits. So we have companies that will do control systems that used to have antennas that made them vulnerable to the E1, this very fast pulse. And now they're not, because they're looking at multi-hazard protection. And what we're finding overall is the costs are really coming down. Conductive concrete, there are many technologies. In wastewater, we're getting manhole digital sampling for COVID-19. And yes, you can also deal with flooding and other contamination. So some of the concepts that now help, artificial intelligence. We've been knowing that it would be essential, but people who've been planning to cope with pandemics realize if you lose too many of your control center staff or experts, you can't do the basic functions. So the AI to at least identify how to keep your system running even at the non-optimal level. And you can also then use it. For example, we know enough about solar storms affecting grid circuits and transformers. If somebody tries to spoof the control system, the AI and deep learning has the opportunity to say, no, that is not what you would get. We know our system so well that has to be an adverse interjection or just a failure of the equipment sensor. So we have between AI and just doing the cross-sector architecting. So we're getting new fields. We're getting resilience architecting. So a hospital will be designed for multiple hazards, including having backup power on site. We're getting, and this is leading to really, I think, a whole set of pathways for resilience careers. We will need people from high school, college, graduate school to train for whatever field, to have it be a field of resilience, not just for that field, but for the cross-sector resilience. It may take a whole generation to get there. So we're in the early stages, but we're seeing resilience being adopted just about everywhere. And last comment, with the first book we did, Powering Through in 2016, we told people you must prepare to cope on your own, yourself, your household, your community, your voluntary associations, your emergency management centers. But the reality was people didn't stockpile for more than a few days, and they thought that the cavalry would be coming. And now with COVID-19, almost every household that can is stockpiling and preparing. So we've made great progress.
We have, Bill. Thank you so much. Okay, Bill, what did you learn in creating this report that you can share with others so they can improve their own resiliency efforts? Just a quick sentence. What would be your one tip to the listeners on the line today?
Reach out to the other sectors that you depend on and that depend on you, and collaborate in the design mainly of new systems, because retrofit is expensive. So plan for a future being economical, how you spend your money.
It's worth the investment. Mary, what about you? What would be your words of advice to our listeners today?
Well, I think that communication has often been the Achilles heel when we have various kinds of disasters. So I would think having solid, good communications that you know you can rely on, that are multi-hazard prepared, would be a wonderful step if you could just have one thing. But one of the things that impressed me about what we did in the book was Americans tend to be very innovative, and some wonderful ideas have come out in the book. And so I think that thinking about how you might do something differently to really be more resilient could also be helpful.
Very good advice. And Bruce, you mentioned that planning on a regional level was your advice, but do you have any last bit of recommendations for our listeners today?
Well, I think I would change that planning from a 3-dimensional model to a 4-dimensional model. And what is that 4th dimension? It's a dimension of time with no power. So, I think right now we're probably looking at maybe, 30 days is the outside for most plans. We really need to build that 4th dimension and lengthen that time without power. And that changes your whole way of thinking about things.
It sure does. Thank you so much. So Mary, I wanted to ask you, for those on the line who might be interested in learning more about the book that you put together, how can they find some more information?
So thank you, Laura. They can find more information because eventually it's going to be out on Amazon, probably before the end of October. And so that would be available in paperback, all color. And we want to also have a Kindle version, and that's going to be at a very reasonable price. And one of the things we're very excited about is that we have had 2 wonderful donors who have said that they will donate money so that we can have the book printed and sent to every member of Congress. And so that's in progress at the moment. So
Congrats.
your people in Congress could have that book and maybe suggest that their staff actually read it. So that would be helpful too.
All right. And Mary, you have a informational summit coming up too. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Oh, that would be a pleasure to do. Yes, we have on November the 18th and 19th, a virtual summit this year. The InfraGard National Disaster Resilience Council has held summits every year since 2011, but this year it'll be the first time we've done it virtually. And so that's coming up, and it'll be 2 days of really enhanced information about and discussions about the various topics. We'll talk more about powering through and have breakout sessions on our book. And we will have a keynote on water and its importance in the world. And we have people from DHS coming and talking about what they're doing about the new executive order on EMP and GMD. And we have a person from there talking about a new book that is coming out and from DHS. And we have an emphasis on COVID plus. And that is COVID plus wildfires or earthquakes or elections or hurricanes and social unrest. So we're looking forward to that and having that as a breakouts also.
Yeah, Mary, if you get a chance, if you would mind putting in the chat the URL for this event for our listeners so they can get some more information, that'd be great. I'd like to thank the 3 of you, Mary, Bruce, and Bill, for the information on this wonderful book and for your input today. And I'd like to pass it over to Tom, who's going to tell you a little bit more about a program we have called the SICE. Tom? Unmute yourself, Tom.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. For those of you who may not be familiar, the SICE it's called the Sensitive Information Sharing Environment, was started by the private sector to address issues just like this. In a complex environment, you've got the normal information that gets shared, But many times that is not the information that decision makers need. They got to go deeper. And sometimes that deeper information is operational. It's competitively sensitive. It is media, political. It's all kinds of sensitivity with that. And it can be shared for the right reasons, but the wrong people get it, non-operational use, and it gets sideways very quickly. So the SICE is a framework that allows us to vet people and information to make sure the information in there has been ranked 1 through 4. We have a standard that the private sector built. You can learn about it if you go to siceusa.org. It's free to register with that. It just vets people. And why is this important? Because when we do cross-sector planning, you got to have a safe environment to talk about some of these issues and how they impact your business. And we find in that cross-sector, that's what I love about this book. When you get into a cross-sector dialogue, that's when you learn stuff you wish you would have known 5 years ago, right? Because you didn't realize that your whole operation was dependent on a supplier who depended on bananas, and bananas is gone, right? And so it's that multi-tiered issues that the consortium work groups work on. And that's why this book, I think, has got a much bigger potential than just being a book. I think it becomes a planning framework to tee up issues that people are not aware of. So we invite you to become part of the SICE. We're going to be promoting this book and related materials through that as well. We're just not going to do it in the general public. So the SICE is how we do that and protect it. So there's no cost for it. It's run by the private sector. As you can go to siceusa.org and register for that at no cost.
All right, Tom, thank you so much. Okay, so now we have some time for questions or comments. So you can do so through the chat room or the Q&A section of Zoom, and I'll start reading those off. So thank you again as we have our participants entering some information to our panelists, and I will see what kind of comments we have. I do have a comment. I think it went to all the attendees. I want to thank Robert from Hawaii, who says Hawaii encourages all residents to have 14 days of supplies on hand to include water in preparation for a hurricane or tsunami. This is because over 90% of our goods come in by cargo ship. Sure, that makes sense. So thank you for that information, Robert. If anyone, okay, the link says the link is not working, Mary, for the virtual summit. So if you want,
Unfortunately, I didn't.
okay. You know what we could do, Mary? We could email everyone who was on the webinar today with the best link. Apologize for that, but we can send that out to you. And I'm going to go ahead and show you the screen that has my contact information too. In case you want to reach Mary or Bill or Bruce, feel free to send an email to me at laura.johnson@ahcusa.org, and I'll make sure they get your inquiry. As you know, we do these virtual discussion series a couple times a month. So our next one coming up in a couple weeks, we don't have the date set just yet, but it's going to be on a state BOC programs and lessons learned from COVID-19. So since all of you are on our mailing list, we'll get that information to you as well. And I'm going to just check the chat room one more time before we conclude.
Well, Laura, while you're doing that, let me pose a question to really all three of you. Is what groups are working cross-sector issues now? I mean, InfraGard is certainly one, but there's a number of them, and half the battle is knowing who's out there that we don't know, but you all might know. Mary, let me start with you, and then Bill, and then Bruce. What groups are working issues like this? You mentioned San Francisco. I think somebody mentioned. Can you speak to that for just a minute?
I can tell you the ones that I have been working with. So there are a couple of things out of the Department of Homeland Security that have been working with cross-sector kind of people. And so that's one thing that is going on. And I know that NARUD, which is the National Association of Public Utility Commissioners, has started an effort, a task force, and is looking at black sky efforts. The EIS Council also does some cross-sector work, so that's beneficial. And the Foundation for Resilient Societies is another place that is doing it. So there are quite a few places that I know of that we're plugged into, let's put it that way.
So that's great. And I would invite folks on the webinar, if you know of some, type them in the chat, please. Why is this important? One of the hardest things in this business is to not duplicate what's already being worked on. We see this all the time. So by cataloging some of this, we can share that amongst the public-private partnerships that are out there and really build upon the efforts of others, right? I mean, that's the whole point. Thank you, Mary. That's great. Bill, how about from your perspective?
So I also recommend the Department of Energy, the Oak Ridge National Lab has a research site that has all the publications of the different DOE labs. And you find many of them involve cross-sector modeling. So Argonne will be working on water, and Idaho National Lab will be doing cyber and energy systems, and Pacific Northwest PNNL. So, and Sandia has for a long time had a multi-hazard resilience modeling effort. So, but then we also have major institutions, many universities now have resilience programs. So you really need, I happen to like Google Scholar as a way, if you find something, find the references, find the citations, and that way you're not limited to one institution. So it's almost a full-time job to keep up with those people who are working on multiple.
It's funny you say that. I had a number of people mention that. And one of the tricks of this is to link research with operations, right? Because that's hard to do, right? Just like it's hard to bring operations to GIS, right? We find the operations people and GIS people have to work together, but they speak a different language, right? And it's the art of focus on the problem. And so these efforts are great. Google Scholar is a great one. Thank you. Bruce, how about you?
Well, one of the things that we're involved in with NDRC is a Joint Base San Antonio. This is an interesting project because we've realized that, you know what, military bases depend on the commercial communities that surround them. And it's a great, I know less about it than either Mary or Bill, but I just wanted to make sure that we pointed that out as a very interesting DoD supported operation that actually is involving several sectors in the San Antonio area with Joint Base San Antonio. So a very interesting project. In my own realm, I usually reach out to the Federal Highway Administration, which actually has some very interesting documents, things like, for example, how emergency management, emergency operations centers, transportation management centers, and fusion centers can actually interoperate by describing in detail how their systems work and what information they collect and share. And also the Intelligent Transportation System Joint Program Office under the US DOT Secretary does a lot of great research work, obviously in the area, the whole area of autonomous vehicles, which are going to impact a large number of sectors. I think we're very closer than most people realize, for example, to have automated truck traffic, hands-off truck traffic. So those are some of the ones that I reach out to in my own area.
Okay, good.
Hey, Tom, we did get a question here for Bill. How do you view the multi-hazard modeling from the insurance sector related to resilience?
Well, I think that's really critical. The insurance sector has wonderful databases, and sometimes when they share, and sometimes they're in competition, but when they share, they provide real insights. So for example, reinsurance companies looked at the solar storm hazard where the electric utility industry was saying, well, it's mainly in the north. And they found that there's no statistically significant reduction down in the Gulf. And now with 3D modeling, we're showing that there are really places in parts of the southern US that are at risk. So the insurance sector has, it not only has knowledge on how to model the hazards, but they can provide financial incentives for best practices. And so they're potentially a major driver to improve resilience, because if you follow their guidance and get a discount, you not only save them money, but you're saving yourself and your community.
Bill, thanks for mentioning that. And if anybody has a contact, we would like to have the insurance sector on to do just that, Bill, is to talk about, it could be a panel, it could be talk about how they get it, how they use it, how they help, owners and operators better reduce risk, right? We need some contacts to get hold of. So if anyone in the chat room wants to throw that out there, or if any of the panelists want to submit that, we'd love to do that, because this has come up time and time again. And we usually get the policy people. We need to talk to the folks that are operational within the within the insurance industry. So if anybody has any ideas for that.
We did have a suggestion. CISA has this National Risk Management Center, and as they are more public facing, they could be a major contributor interfacing with not only the insurance sector, but with others who do risk management for each of the critical infrastructures.
Okay.
I'd like to thank Dan Searforce, who gave an example of a collaborative group here. It says Pennsylvania has a Black Sky Steering Committee that has worked with EIS and is working with state emergency management, private sector, National Guard, and FEMA Region 3 on Black Sky planning. It's interesting. Dan, thank you for sending that comment to us. Mary did fix the URL and it's in your chat room, but again, as I promised, we'll also send that to you via email post webinar. And Tom, that's all the questions we had. Yeah, go ahead.
Lastly, Laura and I and a bunch of folks are working on a National Resilience Summit planning. Early stage, it's going to be January 2021. This is the type of issue that the private sector wants to start looking at, right? How do we build cross-sector planning networks and capacity so that we can build resilience through cross-sector information sharing, looking at interdependencies, looking at, other initiatives that are currently out there. So I think, Laura, we have tentative dates of the 26th, 7, 8. Is that it, January?
That's correct. It's going to be virtual, 3 half days. So 12:30 to about 5-ish p.m. Eastern. So those of you in Hawaii can make it.
Right. So January 26, 7, and 8, 3 half days. Day 1 is going to be looking at strategic topics in resilience. And we got some good ones, right? And this is going to be an effort through combined effort of a number of public-private partnerships in the private sector, certainly. Day 2, we'll look at initiatives. What types of initiatives and projects are out there actually building resilience? We want to really get down to what is actually in the works, right? There's a lot of things talking about getting in the works, but we want to know what's there. And then day 3 is going to be really tactical, right? Training, demonstrations, things that people would like to learn more about, whether it's a guidance or it's a tool or it's a process. Really doesn't matter, but we look, this is going to be an annual thing with the SICE working group and the private sector and the partners. The DHS actually proffered the idea last November when we had a big meeting of the SICE Strategic Advisory Committee. Private sector loved it. And I think it'll be a nice complement to some of the other federal efforts that are going on there. But this will definitely be private sector to private sector with government there. So we're really excited about January 26, 7, and 8 in 2021. So just mark your calendars, more information coming out soon.
Okay. Tom, thank you so much. And I'd like to thank again our panelists for the information today. Great job. And thanks to all of you for attending our virtual discussion. We hope you got some helpful information out of it. And everybody stay safe. Thanks so much. Bye, guys.
Thank you.